in Jesus's time, that is, would have heard and received those words. And it's considerably different in many ways than how we view it. So Bailey writes that his purpose in writing this book is not to rearrange old texts, but rather to add new perspectives to our understanding. So it's time to put on all of our first century Palestinian ears and hear how they would have heard Jesus's words. So let me tell you first a little bit about Ken Bailey. Good morning, Anna. I introduced next week's book already. You weren't here and I thought maybe you wouldn't make it, so I went ahead and did that.
No, thank you.
Ken Bailey, I first heard of and used his text about 30 years ago in St. Louis, and I used it during an Advent study. It's a clear view of Jesus's birth, and I just found him fascinating. So I have continued to read him over the subsequent 30 years. And he has done a lot of reading, and rather has done a lot of writing, so there's a lot to enjoy. One thing that is always interesting to me is how full of surprises he offers on what a story that we think we know so well was heard in its original text. So for instance, in our book today, he explores the story of a clear view of Jesus's birth, but only as one of many different sections in the book. Bailey himself died at the age of 85 in May 2016. He was a Presbyterian missionary who spent 40 years in the Middle East. He was born in 1930 to Presbyterian missionaries stationed in Egypt, and he spent much of his early life in Cairo. At the ripe old age of 12, in 1942, he and his family fled Cairo as Erwin Rommel's Panzer trucks were rumbling towards the city. By that time, however, he was fluent in both Arabic language and culture. He returned to the States and eventually received a BA from Monmouth College and a Master's of Divinity from what is now Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He then married his sweetheart, Ethel Jean Milligan, a microbiologist who was working with Jonas Salk on the development of the polio vaccine. Pretty accomplished woman in her own right. Mm-hmm. Newly married, they traveled to Egypt as Presbyterian mission workers. Bailey initially worked in villages in Upper Egypt before serving as a teacher at Cairo's Evangelical Seminary. In 1965, the Baileys moved to Beirut, where he taught at the Near East School of Theology. They returned to the States so Bailey could complete a New Testament doctoral program at Concordia Theological Seminary in St. Louis. Having already mastered Arabic, he then acquired fluency in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Syriac. I am a total dunce at languages, and I so admire anyone who can learn anything, let alone all of these. The Baileys then returned to Beirut in 1972, where he now headed the biblical department at the Near East School of Theology. They were there through much of the Lebanese Civil War and experienced more than a few harrowing adventures. In 1985, they moved to Jerusalem. Then in 1990 through 95, they were based in Cyprus. In 1995, they retired back to Pennsylvania. Bailey's retirement looks more like a full-throated charge ahead, as far as I can see. He served as a domestic and international speaker, averaging 150 lectures a year. Our very own Dean and Marianne Carzou heard him speak when Dean was serving as a pastor, I believe in the Midwest. In addition, Bailey wrote over 150 articles, 10 books, and a script for a film. Some retirement. Bailey often lamented that Arab Christians seem to be invisible to most of the West today. Most Westerners continue to think that all Arabs are Muslims. This is a tragedy for Western scholars of the Bible, as the traditional languages of their Middle Eastern counterparts, Syriac, Coptic, and Arabic, are generally unknown to most of our Western theologians. Though Western scholars learn Hebrew and Greek, they are cut off from the Eastern scholars who are the inheritors of the traditional cultures of the Middle East, and thereby the Bible. In all of his books, Bailey attempts to fill this gap in biblical scholarship by analyzing the stories in the Bible in terms of Middle Eastern culture, as he has learned and experienced it over the course of his long career serving there. Today's book, again, Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, is thought to be his most important. It was published in 2008. And in it, he tries to magnify those aspects of the gospel he sees as having been misunderstood or overlooked because of our ignorance of Middle Eastern culture. It contains a lot of surprises. One of them is how he spends a whole section highlighting Joseph's important role in the birth of Jesus. And we all, attribute great accolades to Mary, and she deserves study and praise. But Joseph does too, and I've never read any of him. So I was really pleased to see Joseph highlighted as he is in this book. Bailey develops the theme of the Good Shepherd, using his understanding of the shepherding in the Holy Land from the time of David through the prophets to Jesus and then the Apostle Peter. One of his most striking commentaries deals with the Good Shepherd who seeks the one lost sheep, even though it means endangering the other 99. That, like many other parables, has always been a puzzlement to me. My Western perspective is, why would you endanger 99 for the one that's wandered off? Bailey says, how else would you convince the sheep that he would risk all for that one lost sheep? He would risk all the rest in order to retrieve the one that was lost. And thereby they're all secure because they know how great his love is. So I had never thought of it from that perspective. That was very interesting. He said the individual sheep need to know that the shepherd will not leave it to die alone should it become lost. In Bailey's context of the 20th century, and the dictators who, hardened by utilitarian ideologies, were willing to sacrifice millions to promote a greater good, his vision in this parable of the greater, his lens in viewing this story leads me to feel real awe and humility. And it's just points towards what he says is not the background story, it's the real point of the parable. I always focused on the 99 that were left unprotected. He said, no, you need to focus on the one that he will risk everything to bring back to the fold safely. So he shows a different way of looking at it that is much more of an Eastern philosophy than how we normally see it. So I liked being aware of that different interpretation. And it's quite sweet. And it makes me much more comfortable with the parable than I have been in the past. In his chapters in this book, he has a chapter on Jesus's birth. We've kind of brushed on that a little bit. He also has one on the Beatitudes, another on the Lord's Prayer, another chapter on dramatic actions of Jesus, another one on Jesus and women, and finally a big section devoted to the parables. And so what exactly is a parable? Because that's what we're going to be dwelling on mostly today. And Richard Rohr gives us this definition. When Jesus was speaking to groups, he often told stories, parables, to invite people to listen and respond to God. He used parables to catch people's attention and to illustrate and clarify the nature of the kingdom of God. His audiences would have been startled by stories of a Samaritan hero, a justified tax collector, or a father running to welcome his prodigal son. These stories said to his audience, look, this is what God is like. Jesus used these stories to offer spiritual direction by challenging people to look more closely at what they believed and why, what their own experience of God was, and how they interpreted their experiences with God. So again, the parables are full of surprises, and a lot of them don't have endings or closure. It's left up to the reader to decide what the ending is for them. So you think of the prodigal son. Does the elder son ever come back and go to the banquet? Or is he still left out there in the field stewing over the fact that his younger son has been treated better? The woman to be stoned. When Jesus saves her from stoning, is her life changed? He says to her, I don't condemn you either, go and sin no more. Does she slink off and say, escape that time, good thing, and go back to her old life? Or does she say, wow, this is an incredible moment? We don't know how she responded. And so the real question is, how do we respond? The Vineyard Workers. That's always been another one where I saw their point where they had worked all day, they'd been promised a certain wage and received it, but they sweated bullets in the vineyard for 12 hours or whatever. And these latecomers that worked 20 minutes got paid the same. How fair is that? And the vineyard owner says, hey, You know, you were told you would get that wage, you got that wage, you have nothing to complain about. Well, they were still pretty disgruntled about the whole business,
They
you
formed a
know?
union.
Exactly. But the thing is, we're left to contemplate, how did that story end? We don't know. He just dismissed all the workers and got on with his business. So oftentimes, there's no closure. We're left to try and see who God is in the story and who we are supposed to be in the story. The Good Shepherd is the same thing, where you looked at this parable that we talked about briefly a few minutes ago. You know, I would have been there saying, no, I've got to stay and protect the 99. And God was saying, I will sacrifice it all in order to retrieve the one lost soul. So anyway, I thought there were wonderful, wonderful things to be gleaned from these parables. And what I learned is that my superficial understanding of the parables was oftentimes just that, superficial. There was a much deeper meaning embedded in the story. And Bailey does a great job of, you know, finding that for us and sharing that with us. So today I'm going to focus on parables, but most particularly the parable of the lost banquet. Now, all of these parables are the familiar ones that we think we know so well. We've all heard them before, I'm sure. Bailey actually discusses 11 parables, and I think 10 come from Luke and 1 comes from Matthew. So before we get to the great banquet, however, I want to mention a few of the surprises that Bailey gave me in exploring these other stories. One was something that I sort of knew, but I had never put it in biblical context. And that is, in the Middle East, the word no is not the Jeopardy final answer. Now, we think when somebody tells us no, that that's the end of the game, right? No is no. But then I remembered, when you deal with your children, oftentimes that first no is not the final answer. There is further negotiation going on. So Bailey says in the Middle East, no is seen as a pause in negotiation. Isn't that beautiful? I just love that. Pause in negotiation. He said many of us can see that as parents, but he said here, for instance, in the, I think it's Syrophoenician woman, in that parable, you know, the woman comes pleading for Jesus to heal her sick daughter. Now, she is a woman, first strike against her, and a Samaritan, second strike against her. You know, rabbis are not supposed to be dealing with these people. And his disciples say, send her away, get rid of her, please. She's wasting our time. She's taking your attention. And Jesus sort of says, you know, okay, let's play out that theology and see how it all ends. And so he tells the woman no. And the woman comes right back, further negotiations. She offers a little more compelling case on why she needs Jesus to do this healing. And so then Jesus responds with the thing that I find harshest in all of the Gospels, when he says to her, you know, I have come for my own people. Why should I give their, you know, their food to the dogs? And in the Middle East, a dog is right next to a pig in terms of uncleanliness. They don't keep them as pets. They are not, you know, something that is a warm, cozy thing. They are at best guard dogs, and at worst just feral animals running through the village. So to call somebody a dog is a tremendous insult. Now, Bailey points out that actually the correct translation is puppy. So it's a little cozier than we think of with dog, but still it has that impact. And I've always wondered why on earth he must have been having a really bad day to call somebody that, particularly this woman who's beside herself, worried about her daughter. And she presses more. Now she takes what was a real insult and was received that way, I'm sure. And instead of using that anger or using that insult to become angry, she turns it around and says something sweet. She says, but even the master gives the crumbs off the table to the dogs underneath the table. So she isn't defending who she is before him. She isn't justifying it. She isn't being justifiably angry at the way he's talking to her and treating her. She responds to it beautifully. And Bailey says that's her final test, and she passes it with flying colors. So Jesus says, your faith is what has caused your daughter to be healed. And when we read it in our text, we read, your faith in Jesus is what has saved your daughter. I mean, that's the way we always receive it. Our eyes kind of glide over those passages. And we think that's what he's saying, but Bailey says that's not what he's saying. He's saying your faith in God, God's ability to heal through me, all of those things make this miracle possible. And now she's healed. So it's a very sweet, wonderful ending to a real gritty story and a really gritty parable. But more than that, Jesus is teaching his disciples a lesson too at the same time. You see the direction that you're leading me. You want me to cut her off. I'm going to show you how we can turn this around and make it a beautiful thing for everybody. So Bailey does a better job than I do, of course, of discussing all this and explaining it. But I thought it was really a very moving answer. There are other things too. The Good Shepherd that we mentioned before, the superficial meaning that I have always looked at is not the whole point of the story. By and large, the stories don't give us an ending. We've talked about that. It's up to the reader to determine what their experience with God leads them to understand the story to mean. In the story where Jesus saves the woman brought to him charged with adultery, Bailey makes some not so obvious connections for me. The scene is a trap laid by the Pharisees, and we kind of all knew that. The woman is really being used as a pawn. They don't care that she's going to be stoned and meet a horrible death. They never give her a chance to discuss her side of the story or what the case might be. The guy involved is not being brought up. I mean, the whole thing just reeks. But the trap is laid. So when they ask Jesus, what should we do with her? Does he defend the Mosaic laws and the sexual behaviors by saying, the law says you stone her, so you stone her? Does he say, well, we probably should follow the law, but really we can't because, the Romans don't allow us to practice this. They don't allow us to kill anybody. So we really don't have the right to do this. And so if I tell them to go ahead, they're going to cause trouble and I'm going to get arrested for it. So those appear to be the two choices as presented by the Pharisees. That isn't what Jesus does. He opts for another answer. He very cleverly says, I'm just stunned by how clever and brilliant this was. Let the one among you who is without sin cast the first stone. And the Middle East is a shame-guilt culture. So if the whole mob stones her, no one bears the guilt. But if a single person steps forward and picks up that first stone, he is saying, I'm without sin. And that really is a big breach of the Mosaic law. So he will bring shame to himself and to his family and to his entire village. Now that crowd understands that and they slink away. They're all of a sudden gone. And you look at that and think, wow, what a brilliant thing to do. So the Pharisees have been thwarted again. They're not going to give up trying, of course. But now, in terms of the woman, Jesus turns to her and says, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. And again, we aren't told the story's ending. Does this event mark a change in the woman's part? The reader isn't told. But here Jesus upholds the sexual ethics of the biblical tradition, but removes the penalty. He doesn't acquit her. He just refuses to judge her. So isn't that a beautiful ending for me to the story? So we'll never know what the woman did with that, but we know what Jesus did with it. In the prodigal son, Bailey points to its universal appeal. Most cultures have examples of loving fathers and rebellious kids, and even some self-righteous older siblings. But in the Middle East, when you ask for an inheritance while your parent is still alive, it's like saying, drop dead, Dad. The reader would expect the father to slap the son across the face and throw him out of the house. Instead, the picture of who Jesus is telling them that God is like is one who simply gives him his inheritance. When the repentant son returns, the father, very uncharacteristically for a man of such stature in the Middle East, runs to greet him, forgives him all, and expresses joy upon his return. The elder brother also has a typical response. Man, do I see myself clearly in that elder brother. Much like the workers in the vineyard that we talked about earlier, The elder brother is resentful and angry that his younger brother is not being punished for his awful behavior. And I have always seen myself right there with him. And like other stories, we're not told how it ends. The reader needs to decide for himself. So now finally, 25 minutes into this, we get to the great banquet. And Bailey provides so much context that I was unaware of that I am going to do some reading from his book. Jesus uses an ancient 700-year-old conversation that was originally given to the Jews in Isaiah 25, 6-9. It's a beautifully presented image of what God's kingdom will become. So let's begin by reading it. And it's pretty short. Isaiah 25, 6-9. On this mountain, the Lord of heavenly forces will prepare for all peoples a rich feast, a feast of choice, of select foods, rich in flavor, of choice wines, well refined. He will swallow up on this mountain the veil that is veiling all peoples, the shroud enshrouding all nations. He will swallow up death forever. The Lord God will wipe tears from every face, and he will remove his people's disgrace from the whole earth, for the Lord has spoken. They will say on that day, look, this is our God for whom we have waited, and he has saved us. This is the Lord for whom we have waited. Let's be glad and rejoice in his salvation. So really a beautiful image of everybody being welcome. Death is removed and your tears are dried, and we're all together on the holy mountain at God's messianic table. Really beautiful. Isaiah 25. So what happened later? Let's begin by reading it, okay? And it's a little involved, but I think it's so interesting. A 700-year-old conversation begins in Isaiah, where Isaiah dreams of a great banquet to be held at the end of history, in which the Lord of hosts spreads the banquet and serves the food of kings. It will be held on the holy mountain of the Lord, and the guests will include peoples from all the Gentile nations. Death will be at an end, tears will be wiped away, and it will be a glorious day of salvation. Now, shortly thereafter, in the 6th century BC, the Jews trudged into exile in Babylon. A few decades later, some of them and their descendants returned to Judea, but by that time, their everyday language was Aramaic. As centuries passed, synagogues were built, and in them the scriptures were read in Hebrew and translated orally into Aramaic so that people could understand the readings. Around the time of Jesus, a written Aramaic translation of the scriptures began to emerge, which turned out to be an expanded version, much like the Living Bible. The translators took the liberty of adding extra words to the text in an attempt to explain what they understood the Hebrew to mean. The translation was called the Targum. Sometimes the translators took a great deal of freedom with the text. As a result, the Targum is often helpful in discovering how people in the 1st century understood various biblical texts. The Targum translation of Isaiah's great banquet is of special interest. Yahweh of hosts will make for all the peoples in this mountains a meal, and although they supposed it to be an honor, it will be a shame for them in great plagues for which they will be unable to escape, plagues whereby they will come to their end. Apparently, Isaiah's vision gradually became so unpopular that it was totally rejected by the creators of the Targum. About the same time, a 2nd century BC document emerged called the Book of Enoch. This book speaks of a great banquet with the Messiah and affirms that the Gentiles will be included. But the angel of death will be present and will use his sword to destroy all those Gentiles. The banquet hall will run with blood, and the believers will be obligated to wade through the gore to reach the banquet hall, where they will sit down with the Messiah. Not good news. Obviously, the author of the Book of Enoch was also determined to present a categorically opposed view of Isaiah's vision. A third voice on this subject emerged from the Qumran community, the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The community was composed of pious Jews, presumably of the Essene branch of Judaism, and one of its scrolls, called the Messianic Rule, discusses the famous banquet. The Qumran community was certain that no Gentiles would be present. Only pious Jews who observed the law would be allowed to attend. The text says, "And then the Messiah of Israel shall come, and the chiefs and the clans of Israel shall sit before him, and each in the order of their dignity," so in their order of importance, "according to their place in their camps and marches." Earlier in the same scroll, the text affirms that no one can attend the banquet who is smitten in his flesh, or paralyzed in his feet or hands, or lame, or blind, or deaf, or dumb, or smitten in his flesh with a visible blemish. Isaiah's beautiful vision, which saw faithful Jews and Gentiles coming together at God's invitation, had gone badly awry in these three reinterpretations of the great banquet. Jesus, however, had something very different to say about the anticipated celebration. The story unfolds in a series of distinct scenes. So the first one is in Luke 13, it's 29:30. And Jesus says, when asked who will be saved, "People will come from east and west, north and south, and sit down to eat in God's kingdom. Look, those who are last will be first, and those who were first will be last." So surprise, not only are the Gentiles included, but people that were of, quote, "no importance" are going to be first. So this is quite a different interpretation, much more reflective of Isaiah than it is of all the subsequent reinterpretations that have been given. Okay, so now we're going to get to the commentary on this. And in it, there's an echo of Anna's sermon last week. So see if you can pick out the echo. It certainly hit me between the eyes when I was listening to the sermon last week. The introduction is, "A man once gave a great banquet and invited many," and it brings the reader and listener at once to the topic of the great banquet. In a traditional Middle Eastern village, the host of the banquet invites a group of his friends. On the basis of the number of people who accept the invitation, he decides what kind of meat he will serve. On the day of the banquet, animals or fowl are butchered and the banquet is prepared. Once everything is ready, the master will send his servant around the village with the classic phrase, "Please come, everything is ready." And the language of the parable is still in use today. In contemporary Western society, banquets usually have two invitations. The first is often made over the telephone or in a note. On the day of the dinner party, the guests assemble and are seated until the magical moment when the host or hostess appears and announces, "The food's on the table, please come in." Everyone proceeds without delay to the table and the meal begins. Imagine a contemporary Western scene in which the guests arrive and are seated in the living room. When the food is ready, the hostess invites the guests to take their places, but to the shock of everyone, they offer excuses and head for the door. One says, "I have to mow my lawn." The second says, "I must feed the cat." The third says, "There are bills on my desk waiting to be paid." And the three walk out. Yesterday, the guests pledged themselves to attend the banquet. Today, after all the food has been prepared, they offer excuses for not attending. The first man says he has bought a field. Therefore, he must go to see. On the basis, he asks to be excused. On that basis, he has to be excused. On the surface, this appears to be a fairly genuine request, but the examination of that phrase means the genuineness just more or less disappears. In the Middle East, it contains a lot of desert and little agricultural land. So in most traditional villages, to buy or sell cropland is a acting process that can stretch over months or even years. Before a farmer buys the piece of cropland, he needs to learn everything about it. And that is whether there's water there, whether the sun comes up or sets, because that affects the growing of the crops. There's all kinds of things that he has to talk about. The quality of the terraces, if it's terrible, inquire about the yield in recent years. So There's a lot of different questions. It's unheard of that somebody would say, oh, I just bought a field knife to go examine it now that I bought it. The first guest says that he has just bought it, which he must now inspect. And the cultural equivalent would be a Westerner, and I love this, who calls his wife to tell her that he's going to be late for supper because he's just purchased a new home over the phone, and having signed the check, now wants to drive across town and see it. Such an excuse is absurd because home buyers inspect property with great care before they consider a purchase.
Except for in the current market.
Except for the current market, you say, choose me,
Yeah,
yes.
but you're exactly
Yes.
correct. That is
All
the
right.
typical
All
way
right.
things
Yes.
go. Yeah.
In the Middle East, if someone is invited to the nobleman's house, one accepts an audience as expected. An implausible excuse is a deliberate public insult. So that plays, if you present a plausible excuse, that allows the host to save face and the relationship between the two to continue. If only one guest backs out, the banquet can proceed. But if there is collusion between the guests and they all withdraw, it will be clear the guests intend to shut down the banquet. The servant then approaches the second guest. He also gives an excuse. He says that he has just bought 5 yoke of oxen and then he must go test. Man's excuse is unspeakably offensive. He says that he has just married a wife and therefore cannot come. He does not even ask to be excused. Middle Eastern chivalry produces a dignified and respectful manner of talking about one's wife. The third guest is very rudely saying, I have a woman in the back of the house and I'm busy with her. Don't expect me. I am not coming. This guest will be home that night. His excuse is extremely rude and totally unacceptable. Here, the master of the house becomes angry because he knew the excuses were vain and the apologies were insults that demonstrated the hatred of the guests for the host. So after hearing his master insulted 3 times, the servant refuses to continue and returns to report what has happened. So here's where I hear the echo of Anna's sermon. The servant knows, and the master quickly discovers that the guests intend to humiliate the host and prevent the banquet from taking place. On hearing the servant's report, the master becomes angry. And the question of the hour is, what will he do with his anger? The master's response is, cause great anger. That anger generates energy. What is to be done with the energy created by anger produced by injustice? The master has every right to retaliate with verbal insults or go beyond such insults and threaten some sort of action to punish the guests who have attacked his personal honor in public. Such a reply would be a prelude to some form of retaliation, but that isn't what happens. Rather, the master creates a new and unprecedented option. He chooses to reprocess his anger into grace. That same dramatic refusal to retaliate, along with the choice to turn the energy of insult into grace, is seen further in other parables. Their owners of others, armed men have stormed the vineyard in a move to bring the murderous renters to justice. Instead, he opts for costly grace. That was a reflection on another parable. I'm sorry. Here, the master uses the energy generated by the anger of injustice and orders his servant to go into the lanes and streets of the city and bring in the poor, the maimed, the blind, and the lame. These are the very people the Qumran community had decided to bar from the Messianic banquet. So be sure and see that connection there. Jesus is referring to the outcasts within Israel, the people of the land, the common people who heard him gladly. These folks are now welcomed into the banquet, even though they are not worthy of being seated at such a noble host, with such a noble host, and the possibility of their repaying him with a similar banquet is out of the question. And then, only then, the servant says, "Sir, I've done that, and there's still room." Then the master gives the order for the servant to go beyond the village to the highways and hedges and say, "Compel the people to enter." The point the master is making is that he knows the strangers on the highways and byways will not think that this is a genuine invitation, because after all, why would he be asking me to come dine in his house? So he's saying, if they're reluctant to come, take them by the hand and drag them in. I want them. Make sure they know that they are really welcome, that I want them there. So the messenger delivers this extraordinary invitation, and he delivers it in a way that is convincing enough that the people come. And so guess who these highways and byways and hedges people are? Us. We're the Gentiles that finally get included in the great Messianic banquet. That's us. It has long been affirmed that the third round of guests symbolizes the Gentiles, who during Jesus's lifetime had not been approached. In the parable, this last command is given, but the story stops before it's carried out. So what happens with that? When Paul and his friends go to the Gentile world with the message of the gospel, they are fulfilling a vision verbalized by Isaiah and reaffirmed by Jesus in this parable and elsewhere. For Jesus, the Messianic banquet has begun, and the great banquet is his banquet. The religious leaders listening to him are welcome, but if they refuse to attend, the banquet will proceed with the people of the land, the outcasts of Israel, and eventually be extended to the Gentiles. The parable of the great banquet builds on Isaiah's vision by affirming all three stages of ingathering. By rejecting Jesus, the religious leaders were unable to shut down his banquet. Jesus proceeds without them. The outcasts of Israel were welcomed. And finally, the parable projects a vision that included those living outside the community in the highways and hedges. The Eucharist can be understood as a foreshadowing of the great banquet. At communion, believers are invited in the present to participate in the Messianic banquet of the end times. And the parable assures the faithful that they already have a place in the banquet. So that's what I have for you today. Anybody else hear that echo of Anna's sermon and want to comment on it? Last week, as she was preaching, she was talking about Jesus's direction to his disciples to go spread the gospel 2 at a time and go to villages, and they would welcome them and offer hospitality, as is tradition in the Middle East. And if they did not, shake the dust off their shoes and go on to the next opportunity. And this is what the nobleman that was offering the great banquet, that's what he did. He could have responded with retaliation and anger and insult and maybe lawful action as well, but he didn't. He just turned it around and went to another opportunity of people that were willing to come, and then further extended it to the likes of you and me. So that's the echo I heard that I thought was so good.
Stacy, I have two comments. The story of the 99 and the 1. I mean, that story for some reason never bothered me. I mean, I always thought it made perfect sense that the guy would go out and get the one that was,
Was lost.
errant, or out in the boonies. And I've been thinking about why that might be. And I don't know if it's because I grew up in a military household.
That's what I was thinking.
Left behind.
No man left behind. I think that may actually be part of it. Because you think about some of these rescue missions that the SEALs and the Special Forces have been on to, get one person at the peril of many others. That may have something to do with it. And then when I was thinking about that, this week I was looking at a list of Amy Jill Levine's books, because we're getting ready to do her new book for our women's Bible study this fall. And I came across a list of children's books that she had written. I had no idea she had written children's books.
I didn't
But
either.
one of them is something counting 100 sheep, 10 coins, and 2 brothers. I think she used the word brothers. It cut off in Google before I could get the full title. But that made me think about Levine. And, we've done a lot of her stuff together. And, she comes from the perspective of helping Christians try to understand these stories from a Jewish perspective, and very often a first century Jewish perspective, because she thinks we have misinterpreted or not fully interpreted a lot of these stories. So my question for you is, knowing Amy Jo like you do, and having spent a lot of time with Ken Bailey, do you think there's anything distinctive about his perspective that sets him apart from her, or do you think they're pretty much working on the same side of the track?
I would think different tracks.
I would think so too, but I wanted to hear what you
because
said about it.
the lenses they're using are different. His experience as a Christian, teaching Christian doctrines in the Holy Land, he sees it through that lens. She sees it as a very devout Jew who gives us a lot of rich background and resource in how the Jews will see the same story. And I have no doubt that if the Jews were reading some of these stories, they would be pulling different things out of it. Probably things he didn't pull out of it because he's looking at it with a different way. I enjoy both of them and many others because I think that adds so much richness to my understanding and so much depth to my understanding of things. I'm not someone that feels that I can only use one lens. I like to use a lot of lenses. So my guess is she would see it differently.
Because I think her story, her interpretation of the puppy and the dog
Mhm.
thing is distinctly different from his.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
Thanks.
Well, my thought only.
I have her children's book if you'd like to, if at any point, that's helpful.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Great. Which one?
The counting.
Oh, the counting one.
The
Okay.
children's book. Yeah.
Great. Great.
Comment on the 99. It's my understanding that shepherds had enclosures near their fields, and they herded their sheep into them at night. Of course, they responded to his voice.
Yeah.
And they felt protected. So to leave them in protection and go seek the one that was lost, to me made sense.
I've never read that they're in enclosures at night, but maybe that is the case. So
Well,
that's interesting.
it's like in Bethlehem, the animals are brought into the house.
That's
at
something
night.
that he talks about in the clear view of Jesus' birth extensively. Yeah.
They were protected, but
Yeah.
their heat helped keep the household warm.
Elaine, you had a comment over
Yeah,
there.
I had a couple too. Very good presentation, thank you. But on the 99 and the 1, I immediately thought about that is really the basis of our legal system. That you say that it is better to convict. I'm gonna see if I can say this wrong. It's worse to convict an innocent man than let
100 go free that are, yeah.
And the other thing is the whole concept on the parables and the vague endings or lack of endings. I'm always addicted to these things. I can watch it, on what happened. The Waltons 20 years later.
Yeah. Closure.
What happened? I would go there. I remember looking at Reader's Digest, and Guidepost does this same thing too, where you have the story and you go down a little bit further. What are they doing now? It gives the end of the story, and we're not given the end of the story, which is really the beauty of it. We can kind of get our own interpretation. We can do different interpretations. We can think about what really happened. We still don't know whatever happened to Scarlett O'Hara, but it's that open-ended, and it's you think about it in terms of, like, if you're interviewing something, if you're doing something with your children, the classic thing is I can say, well, tell me what you think about that, rather than giving a road.
This is
answer.
what you're supposed to have heard.
Yes.
Did you get that? Mhm. Well, and I think that's part of his point on the parables, that they are open-ended because you're supposed to look and see who you see God is in that parable and who you see yourself as. And in my case, it's often a corrective, but maybe for others it's not. But I think I had never really thought of the fact that there's very little closure in most of the parables, that you're left here. How did that story end after all? And for each of us to figure
It
out.
may be different over time,
Yeah,
you think about
yes,
20
yes.
years down the line, you may interpret that differently because you're going to have a whole
Different
list
experiences.
of historical and
Mhm.
personal references to interpret.
Yeah, that's why now you can take off those first century Palestinian ears and stay tuned for our worship service if you haven't already gone, and hear what they have to say to us today, because it's different. And I think there's historical context, and he does such a nice job of giving you that historical context. I didn't know those 3 reinterpretations of Isaiah had even existed. And so when they talk about Jesus comes back and is running a scene, old movie, that was news to me. I had never put that in context. And Maren did a great job of giving us with the back and forth between the Old Testament and New Testament. And so much of the New Testament is a reflection on previous works of the Old Testament. And so I love the Old Testament for a variety of reasons, but it was a wonderful class to be able to look at and say, oh yeah, I didn't really realize that that was said that way then. And now this is how Jesus is reinterpreting it, or giving it to us again in the New Testament.
While you were talking, I was looking up the lectionary to see if that Isaiah passage was paired with the parable, and it wasn't. It's paired with the communion service and with the Emmaus banquet and with the Revelation banquet, but not
with this. So this is something that Bailey paired it with, through his first century Palestinian ears, he saw it differently. So
it makes me think of it's a Jane Austen book, and there's a wonderful film of it, and I can't remember which one it is, but the mother and her children are left widowed and at the mercy of the brother.
Sense and Sensibility.
Sense and Sensibility. And the Jane Austen mother. And they're riding away. The wife and the brother are riding away. He's inherited everything, and he says, okay, I'm gonna leave my mother and her children. I'm gonna leave her this house, and I'm gonna leave her an allowance. And the wife is sitting there, and she goes, well, maybe they don't need the house, really. It's a very big house for just a mother and 3 children. They could probably use a much smaller house. Oh, well, okay. And as the conversation goes on, they're riding in the carriage, she whittles him down moment by moment until they have nothing, like a pittance and no house. And this is kind of like how the Jews ended up with this banquet.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we could have hierarchy in sitting in the banquet. Then maybe we should just kill all the Gentiles with this death figure and have wade through the blood getting to the, it gets.
And no lane, no blemish,
That's right.
no death.
No
with
pimples,
flaws.
nobody
Yes,
with pimples
yes.
at the banquet.
Yeah.
So it goes, it gets whittled down to only
To nothing.
the absolutely pure end up at the banquet.
And that's where Jesus comes and says, the first
This
are
is
gonna be
way
last, gang.
Yeah,
and the
that's
last are
right.
gonna be first.
Yeah,
I mean, how we do that with communion, sort of how it parallels our own practices of communion across the centuries.
Yes.
Is there a
Yes.
fence around the table? Is there not?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
different denominations that see it differently.
Sure.
And it made me think of what I was trying to remember, the woman who had started the church in Austin.
Jen Hatmaker? Is that in Austin,
No,
Texas?
in Austin, and she was the rebel, the one with all the tattoos.
Oh, it was in Denver, so.
Nadia Bolz-Weber.
Yeah, Nadia Bolz-Weber. River, and she started a church where they had communion, and it was truckers and
Mhm.
bikers and LGBT and everything, and everybody came to communion, and everybody was welcome in this church, and it was, the table was there.
You have to think Jesus
The
would have
table
welcomed that
was-
crowd. Yep.
Jesus
Her
would have-
recent, one of her recent Substack she sent out was a story from that, or I don't know where I came across it recently, but on a woman who then went home, she had been going to this church, sort of just easing back in church, went home, went to her church, she was not welcome at the table. And she called Nadia and said, you know, just how hard that was. She'd sort of she'd forgotten that. And so Nadia tells the story with her permission at church. And they said, well, let's take her communion. They met her at the airport.
Oh.
She flies in and they meet her in the airport with communion. Sort of what that.
Yeah.
I'm also struck, I just looked up the date, how recent this kind of study is. I mean, Briggs was put on trial in 1892 for trying to teach that we should study the Bible with some history and some sociological context.
Put on trial by who?
The Presbyterian Church for heresy.
For heresy.
Yeah, and because this is a very new idea that we should understand, that we should
Embrace
know
it.
the three interpretations of Isaiah. You were really only supposed to use scripture to interpret scripture. And so we're still,
Yeah.
and there's still things we don't know.
Oh,
In
yeah.
today's reading,
yeah.
we talk about David giving them a cake of, there's a cake.
Raisins.
This is the raisins. yeah.
There's raisins that, but a piece of meat, we don't actually know what that word means. And so one place translated a cake of dates and one place in RSV does meat. So that's just what I went with and didn't go into it. But we don't actually know what that
Yeah,
one word
yeah,
is.
yeah.
And I love that there are things we still don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, a cake of raisins, like, were they disappointed it was an oatmeal raisin cookie?
I
I don't know.
Oatmeal raisin, my favorite.
But 30,000 households.
Yes.
Which is just,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
but there's still things we don't know, which is just phenomenal.
Wow.
Right. Anna, do you want to expand a little bit on your book for a
Give
moment?
a
Or
pitch.
Oh,
we just gave the
I
title
love
and the
this
author.
book because he comes from he comes from an evangelical tradition. He's a scientist, but also then has mystical experiences. So I love that it really challenges me. I grew up Presbyterian. It challenges me on multiple levels for people who have faith experiences different from my own.
Great,
Yeah.
Cool.
that's those different lenses I'm so fond of.
Yes,
Great.
yes,
Wonderful.
that's a good thing.
Thank you all so much. We look forward to hearing
Thank
you.
Anna next week and Wendy 2 weeks from now, so.
What was this DVD you were talking about in the library?
Clear view of Jesus's birth.
Is it him just talking?
Pretty
Was cool.
It was really.
It's in the library.
Loved
It is now.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
not just it's gotta be, we gotta catalog it first.
No, the DVD.
No, the DVD.
Oh, DVD.
I don't know. Very good.
She said it's in the library.
I have loved this.
Which is right now.
Again, it's up in the library now. As soon as she catalogs it, it'll be.
Okay.
And Stacy, the family in India, in Kerala,